Every time you pull a crisp green bill from your wallet to pay for a coffee, you are participating in a financial system that feels as old as the nation itself. But the unified, federally backed paper dollar you rely on every day did not exist until 1861. Why did the United States government suddenly start printing its own paper money, fundamentally altering the nature of wealth in America? This is not just a story about ink and paper. It is a story about a desperate struggle for national survival, the centralization of immense federal power, and the deliberate destruction of thousands of competing private currencies that once ruled the American economy. To understand why the government seized control of the money supply, we have to look at the financial chaos that defined the decades before the Civil War. Imagine walking into a dry goods store in the 1850s to buy supplies. You hand the merchant a colorful piece of paper claiming to be worth $5. The merchant does not simply put it in a cash register and hand you your goods. Instead, he pulls out a thick, frequently updated directory known as a banknote reporter. He scrutinizes the engraving on your bill, checks the name of the issuing bank, and cross-references it with his book. Your $5 bill might be accepted at face value, or it might be discounted by 20% because the bank is located hundreds of miles away in a remote frontier town. Worse, the merchant might inform you that the bank collapsed 3 days ago, rendering your money entirely worthless. Or he might declare the bill a clever counterfeit. This was the reality of the free banking era, a time when the federal government issued no paper currency whatsoever. The only official, constitutional money of the United States was specie, physical gold and silver coins minted by the government. But gold and silver were heavy, cumbersome to transport in large quantities, and persistently scarce in a rapidly expanding, credit-hungry nation. To fill the void, state-chartered private banks stepped in. Anyone with a bit of capital and a state charter could open a bank and start printing their own branded paper money. These notes were essentially IOUs, promises that the bank would exchange the paper for physical gold or silver upon demand. At its peak, there were over 8,000 different types of paper money circulating in the United States, issued by thousands of different banks, insurance companies, and even railroads. It was a chaotic, fragmented system that placed the burden of verifying the money supply squarely on the shoulders of ordinary citizens. The system was inherently fragile. If a rumor spread that a bank did not have enough gold in its vaults to back the paper notes it had issued, panicked citizens would rush to the bank to redeem their bills. These bank runs frequently forced institutions into bankruptcy, instantly wiping out the savings of anyone holding their notes. The architects of the American Republic had intentionally avoided a federal paper currency. The Founding Fathers were deeply scarred by the economic disaster of the Revolutionary War, during which the Continental Congress printed massive amounts of unbacked paper money to fund the fight for independence. The resulting hyperinflation made the continental currency virtually worthless, spawning the bitter phrase, "not worth a continental." Consequently, the framers of the Constitution explicitly stripped the states of the power to coin money or emit bills of credit, and they deliberately omitted any explicit authorization for the federal government to print paper money. For the first 70 years of the nation's history, the political establishment remained deeply suspicious of paper wealth, viewing gold and silver as the only honest money. But this fragmented private currency system, while ideologically aligned with a decentralized republic, was fundamentally incompatible with the demands of an industrializing nation facing an existential crisis. The tipping point arrived not through gradual economic reform, but through the sudden, violent rupture of the American Civil War. When Southern states began seceding in late 1860 and early 1861, the financial markets panicked. State banks suspended the redemption of their notes for gold, effectively halting the flow of credit. The newly inaugurated administration of Abraham Lincoln found itself facing a monumental military challenge with an empty treasury. The federal government needed to raise, equip, and feed a massive army, build a navy, and transport troops across a vast continent. The costs were staggering, far exceeding anything the government had ever attempted to finance. Traditional methods of raising revenue, such as selling bonds to private bankers or collecting tariffs on imported goods, were entirely insufficient to meet the exploding daily expenditures of the war effort. The northern banks, terrified of the economic instability, refused to lend to the federal government at reasonable interest rates. Gold began disappearing from circulation as fearful citizens hoarded it. The government could not pay its soldiers, its suppliers, or its civil servants. By the end of 1861, the United States Treasury was essentially bankrupt, and the entire war effort was on the brink of collapse, not from a lack of military resolve, but from a total failure of the monetary system. The government was forced to confront a reality that the Founding Fathers had tried to legislate out of existence. To save the Union, the federal government would have to manufacture its own money. The man tasked with solving this unprecedented financial crisis was Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. Chase was a staunch, hard-money conservative who fundamentally distrusted paper currency, sharing the orthodox view that gold and silver were the only constitutional forms of legal tender. Yet, as the winter of 1861 set in, Chase stared at a terrifying ledger. The government was spending over $1 million a day, an astronomical sum at the time, and the Treasury vaults were virtually empty. The Union Army was freezing, soldiers had not been paid in months, and contractors were threatening to halt the delivery of crucial supplies. Chase was trapped between his deep-seated economic principles and the immediate survival of the United States. In Congress, a relatively obscure representative from New York, named Elbridge G. Spaulding, recognized that traditional taxation and borrowing would not be enough. Spaulding drafted a radical piece of legislation that would fundamentally rewrite the American financial architecture. His bill proposed the printing of $150 million in federal paper money, completely unbacked by gold or silver. But Spaulding knew that simply printing the money was not enough. If people refused to accept it, the paper would immediately become worthless. To prevent this, he included a revolutionary and highly controversial clause. These new notes would be declared lawful money and a legal tender in payment of all debts, public and private. The introduction of the legal tender clause ignited a firestorm of debate in Washington. To mandate that a citizen must accept a piece of unbacked paper in exchange for real property or to settle a debt previously contracted in gold was viewed by many as a tyrannical overreach, a blatant violation of property rights, and a direct assault on the Constitution. Opponents argued that it would destroy credit, ruin the working class through inflation, and turn the federal government into an instrument of theft. Even Spaulding himself admitted the measure was a dangerous expedient, but he argued it was a necessary evil, a temporary war measure required to prevent the total dissolution of the Union. The debate was not merely economic, it was a profound constitutional crisis regarding the limits of federal power during wartime. Driven by the desperate reality of the battlefield, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, and President Lincoln signed it into law on February 25, 1862. The government immediately fired up the printing presses. Because the reverse sides of these new United States notes were printed with a patented anti-counterfeiting green ink, the public quickly dubbed them greenbacks. This was a watershed moment in the history of global finance. The value of the greenback was not derived from a pile of gold sitting in a vault, but solely from the authority of the United States government and the legal requirement that citizens had to accept it. It was a fiat currency, willed into existence by the state. The immediate human consequences were profound. Union soldiers finally received their back pay, holding crisp new greenbacks in their hands. They sent this money home to their families, who used it to buy groceries, pay rent, and settle debts. A merchant who had previously demanded gold was now legally forced to accept the federal paper, regardless of his personal economic philosophies. The legal tender law essentially weaponized the entire domestic economy for the war effort, forcing every citizen who used the money to become an involuntary investor in the survival of the United States. If the Union lost the war, the greenbacks would become worthless paper. If it won, the government's promise would be validated. However, printing money to solve a crisis comes with an inevitable, crushing cost: inflation. As the war dragged on and expenses continued to mount, Congress authorized the printing of more and more greenbacks, eventually totaling $450 million. As the supply of paper money flooded the market, its purchasing power plummeted. The price of food, clothing, and basic necessities skyrocketed. Working-class families, whose wages did not rise as fast as prices, found themselves bearing the hidden tax of inflation. A barrel of flour that cost a few dollars before the war soon doubled, then tripled in price. The greenback's value became a direct reflection of the Union Army's fortunes. When the North suffered defeats, confidence in the government waned, and the value of the paper dollar dropped precipitously against gold. When the Union won victories, the greenback rallied. The everyday commerce of the American public was now inextricably chained to the geopolitical survival of the federal government. While the greenbacks provided the immediate liquidity necessary to keep the Union armies in the field, they did not solve the underlying structural disease of the American economy. The chaotic system of thousands of private, state-chartered banknotes was still operating alongside the new federal fiat money. Citizens and merchants were now forced to navigate an even more complex landscape, juggling fluctuating greenbacks against thousands of different local banknotes, all while hoarding whatever physical gold they could find. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase realized that an emergency wartime currency was insufficient. The United States required a permanent, unified financial architecture to bind the nation together and reliably fund the remainder of the war. Chase envisioned a system that would achieve two monumental goals simultaneously: create a standardized national currency and guarantee a massive captive market for United States government debt. He presented his grand design to Congress, resulting in the passage of the National Currency Act on February 25, 1863, which was refined a year later into the National Bank Act of 1864. This legislation fundamentally rewired the mechanics of American wealth. It allowed independent groups of investors to form new, federally chartered institutions called national banks. However, there was a strict condition. To issue paper money, these new national banks were required to purchase United States Treasury bonds and deposit them with the federal government. In return, the banks were authorized to issue standardized national banknotes up to 90% of the value of those bonds. This was a stroke of administrative genius. By linking the issuance of local paper money directly to the purchase of federal debt, Chase transformed the localized greed of private banking into a relentless engine for financing the Union war effort. Every time a new national bank opened its doors, it was effectively writing a massive check to the federal government to buy the bonds required to back its currency. The physical design of these new notes reinforced the centralization of power. Unlike the wildly varied and easily counterfeited state banknotes of the previous decades, the new national banknotes were uniform. They were engraved and printed in Washington under strict federal supervision. While they bore the name of the specific local bank that issued them, the overarching imagery was intensely nationalistic, featuring standardized vignettes of American history, federal eagles, and portraits of Union officials. For the first time in American history, a citizen could travel from Boston to Chicago and use a locally issued banknote that looked, felt, and functioned exactly like the money from their hometown, accepted everywhere at par value. But the old state banks fiercely resisted this new federal system. The federal requirements for capital reserves were high, and many state bankers preferred the loose regulations and high profits of the old, localized system. By late 1864, the dual system was failing to meet Chase's goals. The state banks were refusing to convert to national charters, and their thousands of varying notes continued to choke the economy. The federal government realized that to establish a true monetary monopoly, it could not simply compete with the state banks. It had to destroy them. On March 3, 1865, Congress deployed a devastating legislative weapon. It passed a law levying a punitive 10% tax on the payout of any state banknote. This was not a tax designed to raise revenue. It was a tax designed to annihilate. Because the profit margin on issuing local banknotes was only a few percent, a 10% tax made it mathematically impossible for state-chartered banks to continue printing their own money. The human impact of this single piece of legislation was sweeping and immediate. Within months, the vibrant, chaotic ecosystem of over 8,000 different local currencies evaporated. State banks were forced to either adopt federal charters and conform to Washington's strict regulations, or abandon the business of printing money entirely. The era of the banknote reporter, of deeply discounted frontier bills, and of localized money was dead. Through the brute force of taxation, the federal government had eradicated its competition. The architecture of American money had been permanently centralized, shifting financial authority away from local communities and state legislatures directly into the hands of the United States Treasury and the newly empowered national banking establishment. When the guns finally fell silent in the spring of 1865, the United States was a fundamentally transformed nation, and nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the money carried in the pockets of its citizens. The federal government had successfully financed the most expensive and devastating conflict in its history, but it had done so by permanently altering the balance of financial power. The chaotic, localized, free banking era was extinguished. In its place stood a centralized monetary regime dictated by Washington and managed by heavily regulated national banks. But the end of the Civil War did not end the battle over American money. It merely shifted the battlefield. The nation was now awash in hundreds of millions of dollars of unbacked paper greenbacks, alongside the new national banknotes. With the existential crisis of the war resolved, a fierce political war erupted over what to do with this fiat currency. The financial establishment, wealthy creditors, and conservative politicians demanded a return to the gold standard. They argued that paper money was an inflationary illusion and that the government had a moral obligation to retire the greenbacks and back every dollar with physical gold. If you had loaned the government gold before the war, they argued, you deserved to be paid back in gold, not depreciated paper. On the other side were farmers, laborers, and heavily indebted Westerners who desperately needed the inflation that paper money provided. For a farmer who had taken out a mortgage to buy land, an abundant supply of greenbacks meant higher prices for their crops and an easier time paying off their debts. Contracting the money supply to return to gold would cause catastrophic deflation, crushing the working class to protect the profits of Eastern bankers. This tension defined American politics for the next half-century. The federal government ultimately compromised, passing the Specie Payment Resumption Act of 1875, which eventually allowed citizens to redeem their greenbacks for gold, but crucially, it did not destroy the paper money system. The architecture built during the Civil War remained intact. The winners of this new financial order were clear. The federal government secured an absolute monopoly over the issuance of currency, granting it an unprecedented lever of macroeconomic control. Wall Street and the large national banks emerged as the undisputed titans of American finance, holding the immense reserves of federal bonds that backed the national currency. The losers were the advocates of decentralized power. State governments permanently lost one of the most vital attributes of sovereignty, the ability to control local credit and currency. The legacy of the Civil War monetary revolution is the foundation of our modern financial reality. The specific types of notes have evolved, and the gold standard was eventually severed completely in the 20th century. But the core principle established in 1862 persists today. The unified paper dollar you use to buy your morning coffee has no intrinsic value. It cannot be exchanged at the Treasury for physical gold or silver. It functions entirely on the architecture of state power, collective belief, and the legal mandate that it must be accepted for all debts, public and private. The transition from physical commodity to paper promise was not a natural economic evolution, but a desperate wartime survival tactic that permanently transferred financial authority from the local merchant to the federal state. This dramatic shift leaves us with a profound question about the nature of the systems we live under. Was the eradication of thousands of local currencies and the monopolization of money by the federal government a necessary step to build a stable, modern industrial economy? Or was it the ultimate theft of local financial independence by a centralized elite? Understanding the world requires looking past the surface of the things we take for granted. If you want to continue uncovering the hidden historical origins and power structures that silently govern our modern lives, subscribe to the channel.